Wyoming Territory, August 1877. The sun hung low and heavy over the plains near Laramie when Marshal Jude rode into the ghost of a town called Baxter's Hollow, drawn by the scent of smoke and something else he could not name. The saloon had burned to the ground 2 days prior. The bank stood with its doors blown open. No one greeted him, not even the wind. He dismounted slow, boots hitting dust like a bell toll. He had tracked the gang this far, 6 men who had robbed a payroll train outside Cheyenne and left 3 dead. He stepped into the alley behind the general store, Colt drawn, eyes scanning. Then he heard it. A sharp rustle. A muffled cry. He turned toward the old rain barrel tipped on its side beneath the back porch. Straw was scattered around it, and behind it a woman. She crouched low, dirt smeared across her cheek, arms wrapped tight around 2 tiny bundles. Her eyes locked on his, wide and wild. The baby's twins were pressed to her chest, one on each side, no more than a few weeks old. They did not cry, just breathed hard and fast like they knew silence meant survival. "Ma'am," he said, lowering the gun slow, "you do not need to be afraid." She blinked once as if trying to believe him. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, her hands shook, but her arms never let go of the children. "Are they yours?" he asked. She nodded. "Anyone else here?" She shook her head. "What happened?" "They came through 2 nights back, took everything. I hid here." Her voice cracked. "They killed the storekeeper. I heard him beg." Jude holstered his gun. "You got a name?" "Keziah," she said, barely above a whisper. "Keziah Darnell." He stepped forward carefully, hand out, palm up. "I'm Marshal Jude. My name's Malachi Jude. You and the little one's safe now." She hesitated, then nodded once. He saw it in her shoulders the moment she let herself believe it. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you out of the dirt." She stood slow, every movement careful. The twins stirred but did not wake. One had downy black hair, the other a faint curl of brown. Her grip on them was fierce, protective. She had kept them alive through whatever horror had come down on this place. He found a blanket in the back of his saddlebag and laid it across the porch. She sat down, the babies still tucked in close, her face pale under the dust. "What are their names?" he asked. "Hattie," she said, touching the cheek of the girl with dark hair, "and Hope." "You got anyone left?" "No," she said. "My husband died last winter. We came west to start over. He caught fever outside Fort Bridger. Buried him in frozen ground with a hammer in my hands." Malachi's chest tightened. He sat down across from her, back against the post. "You got grit. Most would not have made it through last night." "I did not do it for me," she said, eyes on her girls. "I did it for them." He nodded. "You need food, milk for the twins. I got a spare horse. We ride from my place. It is not much, but it is safe." She looked at him long and hard. "Why help me?" "Because I do not leave folks in the dirt," he said. "And because no woman should have to face the world alone with 2 babies and no one watching her back." Her eyes softened just a little. He helped her onto his dun mare and kept her saddle close. The ride back to his ranch took an hour. Along the way, he kept glancing over to her, watching how she held the girls, how her eyes scanned the trees like danger might leap out at any moment. She had lived through something brutal, but she was still standing. His cabin sat in a shallow valley bordered by pine and scrub. He had built it with his own hands after leaving the army. Inside, it smelled of pine sap and iron stove. He laid fresh quilts on the bed. She sat down without protest, too tired to pretend she did not need rest. "You sleep," he said. "I will feed the horses." "Got goat's milk that should do for them little ones." When he came back in, she was curled on her side, both babies tucked against her, all 3 asleep. He watched her for a long moment. Then he pulled the door closed behind him. The next morning, she was already up when he stepped inside, one baby on her hip, the other wrapped in a sling across her chest. She had washed her face and braided her hair back. "I can help," she said. "You do not have to." "I want to." He nodded, handed her a clean apron. "You ever cook over iron?" "I have cooked over worse." They moved around each other like they had done it before, quiet and easy. He saw how she moved, careful, steady. He liked the sound of her voice when she hummed under her breath to her daughters. He liked the way the girls calmed when she held them. That night, after the girls were asleep in a cradle he dug out of the loft, he sat with her on the porch. "It was not just the robbery, was it?" he asked. Something else happened in that town. She looked down at her hands, one of them men. He knew my name, said my husband owed him. I do not know how, but he said I was payment. His jaw clenched. I hid before they could find me. I stayed quiet while they burned the saloon and drank themselves stupid. I heard them say they would come back for me. That I would not get far. You will not run, he said. Not anymore. You stay here, Keziah, you and the girls. No one will touch you. Why would you take on trouble that is not yours? He turned to her, voice low. Because you are not trouble, and you are not alone. Not anymore, she searched his face. You are a stranger. So are you. But neither of them moved away. Weeks passed. He built a pen for the goats closer to the house. She planted herbs in the window box. Hattie giggled first, then Hope. The girls started to smile when they saw him. He carried them both in his arms like it was nothing. Keziah watched him with something new in her eyes every time. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he found her behind the barn, holding Hope while Hattie slept. She looked up. You are good with them. I care about them, he said, honest and plain. She stepped closer. And me, he reached out, touched her cheek. Yes, you too, she nodded, lips trembling. I did not think I could feel safe again. You are safe. With me, you always will be. She leaned into him. He wrapped his arms around both her and the baby, holding them tight. And that was the moment he knew he was not letting them go, not now, not ever. By the time the aspens along the ridge began to turn, orange flickering through green like the first lick of flame, Malachi had built a second room onto the cabin. He used pine from the draw 2 miles west, hauled it back himself, stripped the bark, notched the joints, fit it all snug by hand. Keziah never asked him to. She only swept out the corners and lined the windowsill with dried yarrow and a sliver of quartz she found near the creek. The girls had started crawling. Hope dragged her belly behind her like a lizard, while Hattie pulled herself forward with one determined fist. Keziah kept an oilcloth stretched across the floor and let them roam as far as the hearth, where she'd stacked kindling behind a wooden screen Malachi carved from a split log. That morning, while the girls napped in the shade of the cottonwood behind the cabin, Keziah stood knee-deep in creek water, skirts tucked high, her hands working a pile of wet linen against a flat stone. Malachi approached from the pasture, wiping sweat from his brow with the crook of his arm. You done all that already? He asked, dropping beside the bank. I don't like things piling up, she said without looking up. It starts with one basket, ends with dust in the rafters. He dipped his hand in the water, let it run cool over his palm. You always like things tidy? No, she said, but I like having some say in what stays and what leaves. He watched her wring the cloth tight, arms flexing. I've seen soldiers fold under less than you. I'm not folding, she said. I'm standing. She glanced up then, her eyes holding his, and he felt something inside him slow down like the last hoofbeat of a hard ride. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small tin case. I found this in town last week. Meant to give it to you sooner. She dried her hands on her apron and took it. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, lay a single hairpin carved from bone, shaped like a blooming branch. Her voice was quiet. It's beautiful. It reminded me of how you look when you're thinking. Still, but not soft. She traced the curve of the pin with her thumb. Thank you, he stood, brushing grit from his trousers. I'll take the buckets up, water's low in the trough. Before he turned, she said, Malachi, he waited. I haven't worn anything pretty since before the girls were born. You wear strength like it's stitched to you. That night, after supper, she wore the pin, didn't say a word about it, just twisted her braid up and slid it in. When she bent over Hope's cradle later, the lamplight caught on the carved tip and he couldn't look away. The next morning, she found him sitting on the porch before first light, boots unlaced, elbows on his knees. She stepped outside, shawl drawn tight. I had a dream, she said. That you weren't here. He looked up at her, the skin beneath his eyes lined deep. I was, he said. Dreams lie all the time. She sat beside him, close enough their shoulders brushed. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been if I hadn't married so young. You regret it? No, she said, but I think I mistook safety for love. He turned to her, voice low, and now I know the difference. Neither of them moved for a long time. Later that week, he took her to town. The girls rode in a basket slung between the saddlebags, swaddled and drowsy. She hadn't been back since Baxter's Hollow, and her body tensed as they crossed the main street of Laramie. He didn't say anything, just walked beside her, hand resting easy near the butt of his revolver. They bought muslin, a spool of blue thread, a tin of salt. At the far end of the mercantile, she picked up a length of linen trimmed with lace and held it against her waist, then set it down quick. He caught her wrist. "If you want it, get it," she shook her head. "It's too fine for what we do." "You're not what you do." She didn't answer, but when they reached the counter, she added it to the stack. On the ride home, the sun sank behind the ridge, casting the world in gold. Keziah leaned into him, the girls asleep in the basket between them. "I keep thinking," she said, "about what kind of life I want them to remember." "What do you mean?" "I want them to grow up knowing care, not just survival, real care. A home that feels warm even when the stove's cold." "They've got that now." She was quiet a long time. "I want to be called yours," she said at last. "Not because I'm afraid, but because I choose it." He didn't speak, just reached over, took her hand, and laced their fingers together. The next morning, he rode out alone before sunrise. When he returned, he found her hanging wet shirts on the line, the girls teetering in the grass nearby. He dismounted, tied the reins, and stepped toward her. "I spoke to the preacher," he said. "He'll come out next week, no crowd. Just us and the land." She didn't smile. Instead, she stepped forward, wrapped her arms around his waist, and pressed her forehead to his chest. And in that stillness, the wind threading through the pines, he closed his eyes and knew deep in his bones he had found what he didn't even know he'd been searching for. The preacher arrived at dusk with a mule cart and a black coat dusted from the road. His hands were weathered from more than scripture leather tough and knuckled with old labor. He gave Keziah a nod of quiet respect when she stepped outside, Hope nestled against her shoulder, Hattie clinging to the hem of her skirt. Malachi had cleared a narrow stretch near the grove, where the grass grew soft and the air held the hush of pine. No altar, no pews, just a slat of cedar he'd planed smooth as a table and a sky wide enough to carry every word. Keziah wore the linen she'd chosen herself, stitched into a dress that hung simple and clean along her frame. She hadn't asked for lace, but left a single thread of blue at the collar. Her hair was loosed from its usual braid, pinned back with the carved bone branch, the only adornment she allowed. Malachi hadn't shaved. She'd asked him not to. "I want you exactly as you are," she'd said that morning, standing in the first spill of light over their bed. So he stood beneath the trees, collar unbuttoned, boots clean, a copper ring he'd hammered from wire looped around the last finger of his left hand. The preacher didn't speak long. He said what needed saying, that some promises weren't made for crowds and that some names, once given, could steady a soul better than blood ever had. Malachi looked at her as he spoke his vow quiet, steady, like he was settling a rifle into place. He didn't say love, he didn't have to. The way he touched her hand, how he made room for both girls in the crook of his arm when she stepped close, that was the vow. Keziah didn't cry. She had done all her weeping in the year before. But when he said her name and then gave her his, something in her eased that hadn't eased in a long time. After the preacher left, they ate cornbread and beans beneath the porch lantern. Malachi carried both girls to their cradle after they'd fallen asleep in the grass, full of dusk and milk. Keziah watched him tuck them in, careful not to wake them. Later, she stood barefoot beside the bed, hair still pinned, dress laid over the chair. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice low. "I've never been more sure," she said, stepping toward him. He didn't rush her. She touched his chest with both hands, palms flat, as if learning the shape of him all over again. He leaned down, mouth just brushing hers, and when she didn't pull away, he kissed her like a man who understood what it cost her to give trust again. The lantern burned low. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees. In the weeks that followed, her name changed on the mercantile ledger. The girl's cradle was carved again, this time with a single word etched along the footboard, Jude. Keziah began keeping a small book beside the stove-lined paper, stitched binding. Each morning while the girls napped, she wrote, not for anyone else's eyes, Just a record of what had passed, a hawk circling over the ridgeline, Hope's first tooth, the way Malachi hummed low when planing wood. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked him one night as they shelled beans by firelight. "I think about keeping this," he said. "Keeping you doesn't get much more next than that," she nodded. "I want to build something more permanent, a quilt for their bed when they're grown. A garden that can hold through winter." "We'll do that," he said. "Together." She looked over at him, fingers still working the pods. "I don't feel like I'm waiting anymore, not for the other shoe, not for the storm." He reached for her hand, rough fingers closing around hers. "That's because you're home now." The next spring, she planted rows of onions and potatoes by the southern slope. Malachi built a fence to keep the mule out and strung twine between posts for drying beans. Hattie took her first steps chasing a chicken. Hope clapped when the sky broke open with rain. One evening, Keziah opened her old trunk and took out a folded piece of paper. Malachi watched her flatten it on the table, an old map, worn along the creases. "This is where we started," she said, pointing to a faded ink mark near Fort Bridger. "You want to go back?" "No," she said. "I just want them to know where they came from and how far they've come." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She leaned in without hesitation. "It's a good place to end," he said, "but it's a better place to begin." She looked at the map, then at him. "Then let's begin." By late June, the cabin smelled of dried mint and warm bread. Keziah had begun waking before sunrise, not out of necessity anymore, but because the quiet felt different now, less like a warning, more like a promise. The girls still stirred early, Hope first, thumping her heels against the mattress until Hattie woke beside her, blinking slow in the dim light. Keziah would lift them both into her lap on the porch, wrapped in the quilt Malachi's mother had stitched long before her passing. The mornings had taken on rhythm. Malachi was mending the fence near the creek when he heard the wagon. It wasn't the usual rattle of the supply cart from town, it came from the west, wheels dragging uneven over dry ruts. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and watched it crest the hill. A man sat behind the reins, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard tucked into his collar. Behind him sat a woman in a faded blue dress, her hands folded too neatly atop her lap. The wagon slowed as it neared the cabin. Keziah stepped outside, the girls balanced on each hip. Her eyes narrowed without fear, but with the caution of someone who'd never been visited without reason. The man tipped his hat. "Looking for Malachi Jude." Malachi stepped forward. "You found him." The man climbed down, boots stiff from the ride. "Name's Elmer Quince." "Brought my daughter, Ruth." He gestured to the woman behind him. "Heard you might be in need of help come harvest." "I didn't send word," Malachi said. Elmer shrugged. "Didn't say you did." "But when someone's willing to take in a woman and her young'uns the way you did, folks take notice." Keziah shifted the girls, who had gone quiet. "Who's telling our business?" "No harm meant." Elmer raised a hand. "Just thought maybe you could use a strong back and a spare pair of hands." "Ruth's good with canning, knows her way around a root cellar too." Malachi glanced at Keziah. She didn't speak, but her expression settled somewhere between polite and firm. "I appreciate the offer," Malachi said, "but we've got it covered." "Best ride on before the sun gets mean." Elmer hesitated, then nodded once. "Reckon we'll head east then. Good land near Medicine Bow." They turned the wagon around without another word. That night, as thunder murmured far off, Malachi sat beside the hearth polishing the hinge of the girl's cradle. Keziah folded dried shirts at the table. "You think he came to sell her?" she said. "He came to measure us," Malachi replied. "And see if we were lacking." Keziah laid the last shirt down. "I don't like the way they looked at the girls." He met her eyes. "They're mine, that's all anyone needs to know." She crossed to him, knelt beside the cradle. "I forget sometimes what it felt like back when I had to explain myself." "You don't anymore." She looked up at him. "You never asked for anything in return." "I didn't need to." "I want to give you something," she said, "not just work or care. Something that's mine to offer. You already have." "No," she said softly. "I mean something I've held back. I've been waiting to be sure it wouldn't break me again." He placed the cloth down and turned toward her. "You can tell me." She reached into her dress pocket and unfolded a worn scrap of paper, edges curled, ink faded. It's from my father, before he died. I carried it west thinking I might find someone who would understand what he meant. Malachi took the paper gently. The writing was spare. A single line, "You'll know him by the way he doesn't ask, but still sees." He read it twice, then handed it back. "I saw you," he said, "behind that barrel and every day since." She tucked the paper away. "I see you too, Malachi." He leaned forward, kissed her brow. "Then we're even." That summer, the garden bore more than they expected. Squash crept long across the dirt, beans twisted tightly on the twine, and the tomatoes came red and fast. Keziah taught the girls how to pat the dust away from the roots. Malachi built a second smokehouse near the edge of the clearing, not because they needed it yet, but because he liked building where something would grow. One evening, after the girls were asleep beneath the ticking of the wall clock, Keziah set a folded cloth in Malachi's hands. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a shirt. Simple but sewn with care, each hem tight, thread dyed with walnut hulls. On the inside of the collar, stitched in faint blue, was a single word, Jude. "I've never made a thing that carried a name before," she said. "It didn't feel right until now." He smoothed the fabric, fingers tracing the stitching. "It's the best thing anyone's ever given me." She smiled, not wide but full. "I wanted you to have something that couldn't be taken." He stood, pulled the shirt on over his undershirt, and buttoned it slow. Then he crossed to her and took her hands in his. "You already gave me that," he said. "The day you stayed." Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and smoke. The lantern flickered low. Inside, Keziah leaned her head against his chest, and for the first time in years, she didn't brace herself for what might come next. She only listened to the steady beat beneath her cheek and let herself belong to it. In the high heat of August, when the air hung heavy and the soil cracked in the fields, Keziah found herself standing by the line of cottonwoods with Hattie on her hip and Hope toddling ahead in the grass. The girls were barefoot, their feet dusted and brown, and their hair had lightened in the sun. She watched them move without fear, and the ache that used to live behind her ribs had long since quieted. Malachi was farther out, stacking firewood behind the shed he'd raised in spring Aline to that stayed dry even in hard rain. His shirt clung to his back, and he paused now and then to stretch his shoulders, fingers flexing around the axe handle. "Malachi," she called, shifting Hattie to her other side, "I saw a letter in the bottom of the supply sack." He turned, wiping his face with a rag. "It's from a man I knew in the army. Said he's passing through in a week or so, wants to stop by." She nodded, settling Hattie down into the grass. "You want him to?" "I think I do. He was decent. Not the kind who asks too much." That evening, she sat at the table mending the edge of a flour sack while Malachi cleaned the old revolver he kept now mostly for snakes and coyotes. The girls had fallen asleep in a pile of quilts in the corner after a long afternoon of chasing each other around the yard. "When he gets here," she said, threading her needle, "you mind if I ask him something? Anything. I want to know what kind of man you were before here. Not just what you did, who you were." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the revolver down and looked at her across the lamplight. "I was tired, and I was angry. I didn't know how to build anything that lasted." She finished her stitch, easing the thread through. "And now, I don't know if I've changed," he said, "but I know what I'd miss if I lost it." She stood, crossed to where he sat, and leaned against the table beside him. "You're not going to lose anything, not anymore." They heard the wagon before they saw it 5 days later. The wheels creaked like they carried more than weight, and when it rolled into view, a man with a long scar across his jaw tipped his hat toward the porch. "Name's Charlie Baird," he said, stepping down stiffly. "Mal, you still got that busted knee." "Only when it rains," Malachi said, shaking his hand. "Come on in." Charlie stayed 2 nights. He brought stories of the plains, tales of men who hadn't made it through winter, and a battered harmonica he played low after supper. Hope danced with her arms flung wide, and Hattie clung to Keziah's skirts, delighted. On the 3rd morning, as Malachi and Charlie leaned against the fence watching the sun rise over the ridge, Keziah brought them coffee in tin mugs. Charlie took his with both hands. "She's got a way about her," he said, nodding toward Keziah. "She's why I stopped running," Malachi replied. Charlie looked over at him. "You ever tell her about Cresswood?" Malachi shook his head. Don't need to. That part of me doesn't belong here, she'd understand. Malachi glanced toward the cabin where Keziah was feeding the girls spoonfuls of oats, her face soft. She understands enough. That afternoon, Charlie left with a sack of dried meat and a jar of pickled beans. He promised to write if he ever stopped long enough to find paper. The first frost came early that year, crisping the edge of the squash vines and turning the morning air sharp. Keziah pulled the girls' coats from the trunk and lined them with flannel. Malachi wintered the tools, stacking them neatly in the shed beneath thick oilcloth. One night, after the girls were asleep and the fire burned low, Keziah pulled a folded sheet from beneath the bed and laid it on the table. "I've been working on this," she said. He looked down. It was a map of the land drawn by hand, lines careful and sure. Each section labeled: the bean rows, the smokehouse, the new chicken coop. "Why?" he asked. "Because one day they'll want to build their own, and they should know where they came from." "What hands shaped this place?" He reached for her hand. "They'll know," she looked up at him, "and I want them to know we didn't just survive, we chose each other." He pulled her into his lap, arms around her waist, and she rested her head against his shoulder. "They'll know," he repeated. Winter settled in with hard wind and deep snow. They kept warm with stacked wood and thick quilts, and the cabin held tight against the cold. Keziah taught the girls how to knead dough with their small fists, and Malachi carved them each a wooden animal from white pine, one a fox, the other a doe. One morning, after a long night of snow, Malachi stepped outside and found the world clean and quiet, the sky pale with light. He turned back to the doorway where Keziah stood with the girls tucked against her sides, her face lit from within. He held out his hand. She took it, stepping down into the drift with him. Side by side, they walked across the yard, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The girls laughed behind them, their voices high and bright against the winter hush. Malachi stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked back. The cabin stood solid behind them, smoke curling from the chimney, frost shining on the windows. It was not much, not to anyone else, but it was theirs. He turned to Keziah, brushing a curl back from her cheek. "Still sure?" he asked, quiet. She looked up at him, eyes steady. "Always." He leaned down and kissed her, slow and certain, as snowflakes caught in her lashes and melted between them. And in that moment there was no past and no fear. Only the warmth between them, the laughter of children, and the promise of every morning still to come.